You represent some of the biggest players in the AI domain. I'm thinking NVIDIA, OpenAI, a lot of the demand for compute, or indeed the suppliers to compute, Jason. What are you seeing in terms of the regulatory equation changing to help speed up some of this infrastructure investment?
Well, great to be back with you, Caroline, and you're absolutely right. Policymakers are paying a lot of attention to this issue, and the demand created by the construction of new data centers demands new access to energy sources. Look, we've seen over the last few decades underinvestment in the energy grid, underinvestment in alternative forms of energy, and there are a lot of moves afoot here in Washington to address those issues. The biggest one that I've seen in recent weeks and that we're supporting is something called the SPEED Act, which Congress moved through the House on its last day here last week. The SPEED Act would invoke regulatory reforms to speed up the permitting process for construction of new energy projects. It would reduce some regulatory burden on those construction projects. It takes years and years to put new energy on the grid. Those grid modernization efforts take a lot of time and effort and financial resource. The one piece that Washington is trying to address is reducing the regulatory burden to make sure we can make those investments that we need to make. Data centers are not new. You mentioned Northern Virginia. They've been a data center hub for decades. 2/3 of the world's internet traffic passes through Northern Virginia because it's been a traditional hub. But we're seeing the new construction of data center place new energy demands. And as you noted, policymakers are trying to take action and make it move more quickly.
But what about the checks and balances that are needed? Because I think very much we've been reporting a lot about new players coming on the scene. Companies that have never built data centers before. I mean, boy, Oracle itself, I mean, one of the biggest data center infrastructure investors out there at the moment, has never actually formally built a data center of its own. So how do we ensure that it's safe?
A lot of partnerships are happening. You'll recall in January, on day 2 of the Trump administration, Project Stargate, which Oracle was involved in, also involved SoftBank, OpenAI, other companies that are more traditional investors in these kind of projects. Data centers have been around for a long time, but a lot of new companies are getting into it. As your graphic in your conversation with Josh showed, only about 18% of the current demand for data centers is from the tech industry. Financial services, other related industries are also building data centers. And I think, as you noted, there's a lot of attention being paid by consumers to this issue. They don't want to see their power bills go up as a result of these investments in data centers, and that's why we're pursuing these alternative projects. You've seen tech companies like Microsoft invest in nuclear power. We're trying to move forward with small modular reactors that can power these data centers. And I do think it's important for consumers to understand the value to the U.S. economy, the value to job growth. There was this great report that Vanguard put out last week that said that job growth in AI-affected industries is 1.7%. Job growth in non-AI affected industries is 0.8%, so twice the job growth in AI affected industries. This has an enormous economic benefit. So we need to make sure these data centers are constructed that AI can continue to power the U.S. economy, power wage growth and the like. But there are some things that policymakers like the SPEED Act can do to help move these projects forward.
Well, many would say that actually that jobs growth is short-term in nature. You need a lot of engineers, a lot of builders to build them, but actually don't need that many people to manage a data center once it's up and running. And there's that short-term, long-term perspective as well when you think about the climate impact. How much are the big tech companies really realizing the responsibility when they're having to bring up all this compute and power? They're also seeing their emissions go up and to the right.
Well, I think you're right about the long term versus the short term. It does create a lot of construction jobs, a lot of jobs to build these data centers, and there are also jobs created in the data centers themselves. But I think the long-term effect is really, what does AI mean for improving productivity and creating not only the job growth, but also the wage growth? That Vanguard report that came out last week that I mentioned also noted that wage growth in AI-related industries was 3.8%. versus 0.7% in non-AI related industries. That wage growth is enormously important. It's what's made possible by the data centers. So you're right, the data centers themselves create a lot of construction jobs, and we're going to see that continue to move forward. But it's what the data centers do. They're buildings that contain the future of technology for the country. And the AI servers that are in there and the services that are powered for consumers and for productivity for businesses is really what we need to be focused on going forward. And that's the real benefit of all of this.
It's a global theme, and we're seeing servers and the GPUs that go inside them being put up everywhere. Now, there's a story, a really deeply reported story out today from Bloomberg around NVIDIA and the potential that we are seeing chips, GPUs from NVIDIA get into China's hands, maybe through middle parties. And there's some concerns that Megaspeed, in particular, it's a Singapore-based company, might have been making that able. Jason, how much are your companies thinking about diversion of chips, and how much are they clamping down on it?
Well, I think it's important to remember that in the reporting that you're talking about, that NVIDIA didn't do anything wrong, that there was no actual evidence that any chips were diverted, but it's an investigation of one of NVIDIA's customers, which I think will play out by government. But the broader question that you ask is an important one. This is the question of national security and economic security and where they overlap. The Biden administration took a very clear approach to this, which I think was the wrong approach, quite frankly, and that was to cut off access to the world to U.S. technology. What the Trump administration has done has recognized that there are enforcement matters that will occasionally arise that they need to look into, and they will do that. But as a general matter, the U.S. economy benefits and U.S. consumers benefit if the world can buy American technology. This is a race against China, and cutting off China and denying China access to technology really just provides an incentive for China to bypass the U.S. market and build its own technology for the world. Denying U.S. companies the access to the global market is the wrong approach. There are certainly national security questions that need to be answered. There are enforcement matters that need to be addressed on occasion. But as a broader matter, the idea, as the Biden administration did, and I think did wrong, of cutting off the world's access to American technology, not just China, but the rest of the world. That was what the Biden administration did. That's the wrong approach. We need to make sure that we recognize that the success of American economic activity, the success of American technology, is dependent on America having access to the rest of the world.
Very briefly, what about the approach being taken from federal versus state regulation of AI? The actual large language models, new act here in New York and in California, but are we ever going to get any clarity from federal level?
Yeah, there were more than 100 AI laws adopted at the state level this year, and there are more than 1,000 bills pending heading into 2026. Look, technology is best deployed not with 50 different regulatory regimes applicable, but one common regime. And this is another thing that's on our 2026 roadmap. President Trump just signed an executive order tasking the administration with proposing legislation to Congress that will replace those 50 potential separate regimes with one federal regime. We think that's the right way to go because technology doesn't necessarily need to stop at state borders. We want to have one uniform national regime rather than a patchwork of 50 regimes. That'll be better for the technology. It'll be better for consumers and businesses that want to make use of that technology. That's something we're really hoping happens in 2026.